the roll.
Representative Alleman?
Present.
Representative Angelos?
Here.
Representative Haroldson?
Here.
Representative Pendergraft?
Here.
Representative Sherwood?
Here.
Representative Smith?
Excused.
Chairman Bear?
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, we'll bring this meeting to order, and Representative Filer, would you please come forward and present Senate File 40 to us?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My portion will be about 2.5 minutes.
All right, well, welcome back to Appropriations, where we pass and kill more bills than any other committee.
That's true, sir. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like, if I could bring Representative Mike Ian up.
Sure, Representative Yen, please come forward.
And
Happy to have you here in Appropriations as well. And we did set a record, just so you know, this committee accomplished 50 bills in the first half of the legislative session, of the general session of the 68th. So very proud of this crew of people up here. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And would you please proceed in presenting Senate File 40 to us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, what I would like to do is let the Representative Mike in to go ahead and present the bill, and then will give you a story behind it in order why we should have this bill and or maybe probably get rid of.
Representative Filer, we enjoy stories in House Appropriations, so we'll look forward to that. Representative Yen, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, members of House Appropriations, thank you. I bring before you Senate File 40, Zoning Protest Petition Amendments. You'll see that it's sponsored by the Joint Appropriations Committee, but this bill came out of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force over the interim. So the task force was tasked with figuring out how we could reduce regulations in ways that would support Wyoming. And so one of the topics in that was talking about housing, but really broadly development more in general. And this was one of those things that was brought before us that actually made it through the gauntlet, which not many bills did make it through the gauntlet of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. So Senate File 40 is basically a bill that amends the protest petition process. So what's the protest petition process, you might ask? So members, when a municipality goes through any changes, and you'll see this on page 1, line 12 and 13, they go through an entire public process. But then this was added by state statute to give the public another chance to intervene in any changes. And what has ended up happening is that the public tends to use this as an anti-growth tactic for, essentially, I would call it lawfare, to stop development in its tracks or delay it as much as possible. And so what the task force decided to do was put a little bit more guardrails around the zoning protest petition process. And that process gets a little tighter in the bill, but the members were kind of split on how they would proceed. And so you'll see it's a blue sheet. So all of these factors have been kind of tweaked by either the task force or the Joint Appropriations Committee and then the Senate. And so really that's the policy decision of both bodies to determine whether those boundaries that we've changed make sense. So you'll see that there's a little bit more restriction on the type of folks who can protest, and that's to prevent the folks who are trying to protest just to stop things rather than trying to protest about something that has a concrete and particularized harm. And then we talk about who is within that body of folks who are allowed to protest as well. So they have to be types of landowners, and then you have to get enough signatures that represent more than a certain percentage of owners. The issue that the Regulatory Reduction Task Force had was that this creates uncertainty for developers, it creates longer timelines for developers, and all of that increases the cost of building. So whether it's housing or commercial, et cetera, uncertainty breeds cost increases. And that was really the motivation behind restricting it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Representative Filer, and then we can continue on from there.
All right, Representative Filer, we're into short stories here, so please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I kind of want to bring up a personal, actual story that just happened right here in our city not too long ago. And to let you know that the processes prior to this actually do work in our communities. So there was a potential project that was in our neighborhood, and a lot of the neighbors were very concerned about it. So there is public notice that has to get put out because there's going to be a zone change and a land use change. And so the developer did ask for those zone changes, so it allowed, it made it to where they had to go notify all those surrounding property owners. Well, when they found out what the zone change was going to be and the intended use, of course, there was an uproar. And they went down to our city hall and every single meeting and fought this project. I'm not going to mention the project because I don't want to deal with the developer or anything like that, but eventually the developer did pull that use. So what would have happened if that developer had a different use and all that public comment came back is, yes, we like this, go ahead, right? So they get a building permit, they start building, but now you have another process that could possibly happen with a bunch of people coming back and adjacent landowners saying, wait a minute, whoa, we don't want this. We don't want this, and they're gonna start another petition to stop or delay the project. When the original process that's already there already works, and it's proven. It's proven in my community very well. It actually does work. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I honestly, I would think that I would like to see this layer of bureaucracy that we have against our developers and against people that want to develop their property. I'd like to see it go on, Mr. Chairman, and there is an amendment that you guys would have on your desk if you guys would so choose to do. Would pretty much just delete this and get it off the books because it is a layer of bureaucracy that our developers don't, we shouldn't have to fight for our project and then fight for our project again and again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Questions for the bringers? Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I saw the word harm in here. I'm trying to find it again. And I'm just wondering, when I see that, who gets to determine what's the definition of harm? If you could.
Representative Filer? Or Representative Yen?
Mr. Chairman, we both might have the same answer, we might not, but I think the definition of harm would be, is if you're an adjacent landowner and you believe that's gonna harm you in some way or another.
Representative Yen, would you like to opine?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I suspect that it would be the county commissioners first, and if the members of the protest petition feel like the county commissioners, or sorry, the city councilman, because this is cities and towns, my apologies, were incorrect, they would go to a lawyer and go to court and sue over saying that the protest petition should be allowed. All of that to say, even that would cause more harm, right? Because it would delay the process of building even further, which is why I brought the amendment, because during the Regulatory Reduction Task Force, I was in favor of repealing and thought we should go stronger. There were some members that just thought we couldn't get it through, but I disagreed with them, and that's why you also have this amendment in front of you now to make it a full repeal.
Representative Yen, since you're intimately familiar with this bill, in the Senate deliberations, do you know if there was an effort to repeal in their deliberations?
Mr. Chairman, members, I don't know. I don't think so. Looking at some of the amendments, I'm pretty sure that wasn't brought up.
Okay, all right. Further questions for the bringers? I have a few. Representative Filer, you mentioned there was a first effort to change the zoning where there would be opportunities for landowners, and then there's this petition, this protest petition, which comes later. What is the time frame between those two efforts?
Mr. Chairman, I believe each city probably has some of their own ordinances on those timeframes. And, so they write their own ordinances and laws when it pertains to that. But I know in my community, it's usually 45 days total process where mailings go out to the adjacent landowners. They have time to go to the planning meetings at the municipality, and also all the municipalities, council meetings that bring forth this project where they get a right to speak, protest, or speak in favor of the project. And it does work very well. If there's a project that's going to do harm, your neighbors are going to let you know, I promise you, because it does happen. Yep.
Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. To add on that, some towns have planning commissions that look over changes first, but I'm pretty sure almost all of them go through the same ordinance process that frankly we do here, where it goes through 3 separate readings. So there is an opportunity for the public to intervene at any time throughout the whole process without this extra bite at the apple. That's basically what the protest petition is. It's extra bite at the apple to delay something.
So Representative Yen, this extra bite at the apple is 45 days later from the first notice. Would you agree with that statement?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think
Well, I
that is
guess
the case.
Representative Filer stated that it could be different amongst different communities, but typically around 45 days. Representative Filer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe, so once you go through your full process and all the public comment, okay, say you get your building permit, you start building, that could be a time when the folks come back and say, hey, this could do harm. So it could be, but you might be 3-4 months out from breaking ground too. We don't know. So, but this allows them, within that 140 feet or 300 feet to allow those property owners, even though they've already received notice, they know the project's going in. But then once the developer starts breaking ground, that's when they come back and try to fight it and delay the project. So it just creates uncertainty for the developer and also the landowners, because they do have, and it's mostly like 5 different meetings. I think here in the city of Cheyenne, it's 5 or 6 meetings that the public actually gets to go to fight a project or be in favor of a project, Mr. Chairman.
So Representative Filer, this protest could happen any time during the construction. Is there any time limit within the statute? And is there any limitation? I mean, you could, based on what you're telling me, you could finish the project and the protest could come. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, and I think there might be some ordinances written. I don't want to speak directly for the municipalities, but the way I see it, yeah, it pretty much, any time after, it's already been approved. They can jump in there and change the rules in the middle of the game.
Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for bringing this today and having the conversation. So looking at this, I read through it and kind of got associated with it, but didn't realize about the amendment coming. So let me ask this question. Obviously, this would be completely repealing 15-1-603. So completely repealing the secondary process where someone can bring a petition saying, hey, we have a problem. So there would still be the 5 meetings before. There would still be all of that. This is simply just saying, hey, if we repeal this, we just don't give that secondary measure where they could say after we're already in process of building or in process of planning or wherever you're at in that process after you've already gotten the okay from municipalities. We are just simply saying here that you can't go back on your word, so to speak, after due process has been done. Am I following that right, guys?
Representative Filer.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harrelson, you're absolutely correct. And let's not forget though too, that after all those, 5 or 6 meetings where the public does go in and comment and everything like that, in these meetings, we have local elected officials that actually vote on these. So, we have representation as far as our citizenry also that has that on those city councils that actually vote on these projects. And but yes, Representative Harrelson, you're absolutely correct. This is just and it does scare a lot of developers to the point where, it gives them that uncertainty, like, we got to go ahead, we're gonna go here, we're gonna go build some homes, right? Which we all needed, especially in my community, we need homes. But there's always that threat that something could stall that project, and when that happens, it creates litigation, it creates a lot more expense to the developer, then in turn, guess where that rolls down to? That rolls down to the consumer. And because a developer doesn't do it to not make money, they do it to make money. So when we think about that, and we're trying to keep our housing from inflating, too much, this is one layer of bureaucracy that we could take away to keep that inflation down, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Representative Harrelson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So a follow-up on that, you guys. Do we know when 15-1-603 was brought into our statutes? Do we have an idea? And I don't need to know the exact year, but has this been on books for 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? Do we have an idea? More? I'm getting fingers up, higher? Okay. So this has been a long-standing statute that we're looking at repealing.
Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. It's been in there for a while. I don't know the answer, and maybe I'll defer to other folks who come to the stand, but it's been there for a while.
I have a follow-on question along those lines. So it's been there for a while. Do either of you have an inkling of what the surrounding states have in regards to this type of process? Looks like we got somebody in the crowd that can help answer that. We'll get to them in a moment. All right? Okay. Any further questions? Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at this and just keeping it straight in my own mind. Senate File 40 doesn't repeal this statute, it amends it. And one of those amendments on page 2, affirmative vote of 3/4 and then was reduced to 2/3. I'm wondering, Representative Yen or Representative Filer, if you could talk a little bit about the discussion that brought that about.
Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, I would have to check of whether that's a Senate amendment or was something that came out of the committee. I honestly would not, I'm not sure. I believe that the discussion that we did have, I mean, I'm sure we had discussion about how much of an affirmative vote would be required to override the protest. And I'm, like I said, there were many places where people were wanting to touch the little factors to see if we could make it better, which is why I've just brought you the full repeal, because I thought that's the best way to make it better.
I think we have one of the bringers of one of the amendments that can probably share with us what happened in the Senate, so we'll get to them in a moment. I do have a question just from your perspective, Representative Yen, on the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. It appears that in this bill, we're putting the sideboards on, if you will, that you mentioned, where we're tightening it up by going from 20% for the petition portion to 33%. That makes it a little higher hurdle to get over. And then we also are lowering the threshold for overturning that petition from a 3/4 vote to a 2/3 vote of the body that makes that decision. But I find it interesting, it looks like we're expanding the number of people, and maybe that just makes the percentages harder to get, but from the 140 feet to 300 feet, it seems to me like you're bringing in more potential petitioners. Is that an accurate statement by expanding it from 140 to 300 feet?
Mr. Chairman, that's how I would read that, and I think that was one thing that changed in the Senate. Again, I don't have it in front of me which amendments were theirs or not, but.
Okay. I'm trying to look through them now. Wished I'd done a little bit, yeah. Yeah, it was 500 coming out of the task force. Now it's 300. So that's helpful to know. Okay. All right, any further questions for the bringers? All right, I'm going to open that up right now for electeds. So Senator Guru, if you'd like to come forward, or is there any other electeds here that would like to opine on this? Looks like Representative Storer, would you care to weigh in on this bill? Okay. All right, Senator Guru, thank you for coming to House Appropriations. We appreciate you being here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Always a pleasure to see you all. Mike Guru, Senate District 17, also the co-chair for this purposes of this discussion, co-chair of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. I'm sorry I was a little late. You know how senators are, we're a little slow. But I apologize for being late, but here we are. I'll try to go through some of the questions, and I didn't, like say, hear all of the good Representative Filer's comments, but from my standpoint, just kind of walk through a little bit.
Please.
This came to the Regulatory Reduction Task Force, actually from the chief executive and his team, and the goal was to get the state out of this business and leave it to local control. And so what they were looking for was a total repeal. The Regulatory Reduction Task Force saw it a bit differently. And as we worked through the summer and talked about this bill at virtually every meeting, we worked it, and as you well know, because as you, through the committee process, we played with the numbers, we played with the number of feet that to be used to notify people, the number of people to be notified, how many could overturn this and do a protest position. Still, some of us felt it should be repealed and left to local control, but that wasn't the will of the majority. We got a lot of testimony from a group called the Pacific States Legal Foundation, and it's operative, and I have to look here in the bill exactly where it is, but actually, I believe on page 1 of the engrossed copy, line 12 to 15, on this, the line starting on page 14, owners who can demonstrate a concrete and particularized harm, who either own, and then it goes on in percentages. That language was put in specific to try to hone down who could petition. Basically, the problem was this, that one person or one or two people, adjacent landowners, who just didn't want something to happen, didn't want anything to happen, could short circuit a whole process. And so at the first level, having the state have that rule across the state was a problem, I think, to the folks who were interested in bringing this in the beginning. And remember at the time, and I don't recall either how long that was discussed, you were discussing how long this has been in effect, but been in effect since before towns and counties were really doing much zoning at all. So basically, this was a state cookie cutter approach to development at the time before there really were many rules or sideboards there. And so it kind of harkened back to an earlier time where today most communities have more robust zoning packages, most counties do as well. So that was kind of what we wrestled with and what we struggled with in the task force, was how much and how far. But that verbiage, that language there from that legal foundation was kind of the linchpin. To say you had to demonstrate a real threat, like if it was something that was going to do something to, it was going to have a demonstrative effect, a real effect on your property, not just some theoretical thing. Wow, this development's going to run my property value down. Those of us who are former local electeds hear that one a lot. And so that was kind of where we were going. But at the end of the day, we tried to make it, they couldn't take the leap to repeal, but tried to make it tighter and tighter to how people could protest. In the Senate, I felt duty-bound as the co-chair and the Senate chair of the committee, even though I felt repeal was the way to go, to hold that position for my committee, because I was there for my committee. And so it really was not discussed about total repeal. When Representative Weiler took on the management of this bill on the House side and mentioned to me, and Ben was quite specific about his feelings, as he always is, as I've known him for years, always has been, about total repeal, I said, well, that's kind of where we were going in the beginning, and that's kind of what was the point. But so here we are, and that was trying to get to some of the questions that have been asked up to this point. That's kind of where we are, is that it's still a state law that frankly I think should be repealed and left to local control, but here the law sits. And all it was trying to do was hone in about who could protest, how they could protest an application for a building or a development. That's what this bill does. That's what the bill is.
Okay. Questions for the senator? All right, I have just a couple of questions. Sure. So the Regulatory Reduction Task Force actually expanded it out to 500 feet, it looks like. So this bill came to the Senate body at 500. Your body reduced that to 300. Can you give us any information about the discussion about 500 feet and how that came about?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good question. Once again, the Senate kind of had some of the same issues that the task force had about making sure, trying to cut that line between being fair to neighboring landowners about being notified and informed of what's happening by, legal means, or, if they were going too far with that. And so they pulled it back to 300 feet. They set it at 300 feet, but still that operative language about the peculiarized, more intentful interest still was the linchpin of that.
Okay. I have one more question for you as the co-chair of that Regulatory Reduction Task Force. Were there discussions about the time limit or lack thereof where you go through the zoning process and then somebody starts construction, as you heard the testimony before, and then this is potentially can come at any moment? I can't imagine that there's no limit to where this would end. And was there any discussion about putting a limit on, from the change of the zoning, voted on by the body that makes that decision, until this is no longer a possibility?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can honestly say I think maybe others who can testify might be able to speak more accurately about that. As I recall the discussions, I think we were trying once again to let the local jurisdiction, work through that as far as in their rules and regulations, as best as I could recall.
Thank you, Senator. I guess my question would be, was there any testimony about what other states are doing and where they, honestly, your job was to try to create less uncertainty for developers, and that sounds like an awful lot of uncertainty if that's capable, this protest is capable of being done anytime, all the way up till finish of construction. Actually, I can't imagine, that seems crazy.
I share your pain, Mr. Chairman. Actually, it's one of the knocks on the Regulatory Reduction Task Force in general is we seem to add more regulations than we repealed. And while I, kind of thought we were trying to do our best, maybe in this case, I think this is one where we missed the mark. That's why when Representative Filer told me about, hey, we should just get rid of this, let the local ordinances control it, as they talked about, as a former city councilman and those of you that have been in that position. No, you have 3 readings, we have in our zoning regulations, we have all kinds of pre-conferences, 3 readings of ordinances, 3 readings of development petitions. There's a lot of layers there to go through. So this layer seems unnecessary to me still to this day.
Senator, I've been through this process in another state, and I do consider it important for adjacent landowners for the protection of their property, private property rights. So I don't know that eliminating it is really the right move, but I do see where your good work in that committee was important to try to put some limitations on it to encourage developers and give them some certainty. So don't knock it. I think you did good work.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Like I say, I think at the end of the day, I think the message was pretty clear that what the task force wanted to do was to try to help developers get through the process in an expeditious way, with still protecting landowner rights. And that was the key. So there was as usual, there was some discussion on how we'd get there, but that was the sole purpose of this legislation, was about protest petitions for that.
I know I broached it already, Senator, about the potential of there being a time limit for these protests, and there was no discussion, but what are your thoughts, before I ask other people that are here to testify on this, on having a time limit to where these protests would have to cease?
I think, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I think that a time limit would be prudent, at least if nothing more, if we're going to keep this on the state books to let the localities know what we're thinking on that, and would be happy to entertain the thoughts of the Appropriations Committee.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for being here. All right, we'll open this up. I'm going to start by having the departments that are here to speak on this, please come. Oh, we have another elected official, though. Mayor, if you could come forward first. And Director Durrell, you're welcome to come on up and bring your staff, and we'll get to you next. Welcome, Mayor. Please introduce yourself for the public and let us know what your thoughts are on this particular bill.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Appropriations Committee, I'm Mayor Patrick Collins from the City of Cheyenne. I came just to watch today, but you asked a couple questions I have the answers for, and I thought I might be able to help. Mr. Chairman, you asked about timelines. And The protest petition is only on the third and final reading. So if we get it a month or two before, on second reading, a simple majority moves it to the next reading. But on the third and final reading, we have to have the supermajority. In my community, that'd be 8 out of 10 members have to vote affirmative. And actually, that's not true. 8 members have to vote affirmative. If only 8 show up, all 8 have to vote yes on third and final reading. So it's not retroactive. Once the third reading is done and we publish it, there's no appeal other than to go to district court if somebody thought we were arbitrary and capricious in our actions. And so there is a timeline. So we receive a protest petition. Our city clerk goes through, verifies the signatures are within the limits that they need to be, and then we're put on notice that on third and final reading, we have to have a supermajority of 8 members to approve that. I think the 300 feet, sir, makes sense. We notice everybody within 300 feet of a project. And for me, it's personal property rights, both for the developer who's trying to develop their property and the folks who are around there. So that means that everybody within 300 feet are noticed. It invites them to become part of our process. And then we have an opportunity to listen to their testimony and make them aware by getting a letter in the mail that, hey, something's coming. People are busy in their lives, they might not notice it, so we want to make sure everybody within that radius knows a project is coming forward. We do that on every zone change. So I think that that's maybe why the 300 feet. I think that's the distance most communities probably send notices out. And so that made sense to us. I will tell you that the bill as it's written now is an improvement from my perspective. Currently, we need 6 of our members to approve a zone change. This would mean that we'd have to have a 7th member rather than an 8th member. I think it makes it a little easier for the developers. We've had a local developer bought a piece of property to develop an apartment complex. It's a complicated process. We had a lot of offsite improvements they would have to do. We only were able to get 7 votes. So now he has a piece of property he owns and he can't develop in a profitable way because all the offsite improvements they have to do, unless you're going to build multifamily there, you can't get the density in order to make this thing pay. So he's sitting on a piece of property now he can't develop. We need the housing. He needs to be able to build it. So for me, that was a disappointing experience for everybody involved, but it happened. But I thought you might want to know about the process. There is a time limit, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. That's very helpful. Questions for the mayor? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor, for being with us this morning. I just want to clarify that the example that you gave us, that notice process won't change
Yes.
if this bill goes through. Is that correct?
Mayor Collins.
Yes, ma'am. In Cheyenne, we were going to notice 300 feet. I don't remember what the bill said you had to notice, but yeah, in Cheyenne, we notice it on all zone changes, ma'am. I hope I answered, did I answer that question correctly? Or was I responsive?
Representative Sherwood.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that everyone who is listening or speaking on this bill understands that local communities will still notice if there is a zoning change. So if this is repealed or this bill goes through as is, that zoning or that notice process does not change.
Mr. Chairman, through you, that is exactly correct. Every zone change we do, we notice. And then just for your information, in Cheyenne, we do a public hearing on that and it goes to our planning commission. So we notice that, we put it in the newspaper. We have a public hearing and our planning commission makes a recommendation to the governing body. And then it comes to us, and then we have a first reading where it's read in, it goes to a committee, comes back to the governing body, back to committee, back to the governing body. So we have 5 more meetings where we discuss these things. And as the good representative talked about earlier, there's a lot of opportunities for people to come and talk to us through this process. And most of the time, the governing bodies listen and they'll either put limitations on developments or whatever to make sure that it's fair for everybody. But every once in a while, some people just don't want to have something that looks different than them next to them. And in today's world where we're trying to build more workforce housing, in 1950, the average house was 950 square feet. Today, they're much larger. For us to be able to build workforce housing, we're gonna have to go back to the 1950s and build smaller homes on smaller lots. And a lot of people just don't want that next to them. And so I think we're gonna see more and more protest petitions as we try to build more workforce type housing in our communities. And 8 out of 10 members is a high bar to jump.
Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Collins, thanks for being here. Looking back at how this bill originally entered into our Senate, it had 50% instead of 33%, and it had a simple majority instead of 2/3. And so I'm just looking at, I hear the conversation. It is an interesting conversation. I guess I didn't realize there was this opportunity in our statutes, so I'm learning something today. Can you talk a little bit to that? Do you feel that going from a simple majority to 2/3, is that going to, I know you went from 8 to 7, now you'd be back down to 6. What do you feel like that's going backwards? Can you talk a little bit to the just full repeal? Can you kind of just give me your heart as you're looking at what you guys are fighting and dealing with, kind of a unique experience here in Laramie County? Can you kind of talk about your heart on this and give us, I'm asking for an opinion, sir.
Mayor Collins?
Mr. Chairman, through you to the representative. Sir, I would tell you that with all the public processes that we have, we notice the property, we send letters, we put it in the newspaper. We really try to make sure that everybody is aware of a project that's going to go in their neighborhood. And our city council is the government closest to those people. At the end of all of that, when we've gone through all the process, I think a simple majority, honestly, is fair. I mean, we're going to listen to all of the different sides of an issue, and we're going to try to do what we think is very best for the community. And I think that's what you guys do, that's what we do. And to me, a simple majority at the end is what's nearest. But what I think is really important is making sure that everybody gets to be part of the process so they're heard through that process. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mayor. We're good. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Director Durrell, thank you for being here. Welcome to House Appropriations.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite places, Chairman Barrett.
Should be.
And the rest of the committee, thank you for taking some time today to look at this. What I'd like to do is provide a little bit of context. So my name is Josh Durrell. I'm the CEO of the Wyoming Business Council. And ultimately, our job is to understand what are the constraints to growth in Wyoming and how do we remove those constraints so that we can have a very resilient economy. Now, that's a whole lot of words that really means we want to keep our youth in the state and provide them opportunities. And today in Wyoming, we are not good at that. Our youth leave at an alarming rate. In fact, the only state that is even close to us is West Virginia. And the people that are born in Wyoming, by and large, leave 65% by the time they're in their 30s, and they do not return. There is no boomerang effect. So that is something that we take very personally and that we work on. And you're probably wondering, why is he talking about the youth exodus in Wyoming as it relates to housing? Because it turns out that opportunities for jobs, opportunities for housing, opportunities for community, those things are all closely, not just closely, but those are contributing factors to youth exodus. So as you look at this particular legislation, what I would encourage you to do is not only look at the details of it, which you're doing, and you're doing a good job of, and trying to understand the details, but I also ask you to take a step back for a moment and remember that the reason that we think housing is so important in this state and making it easier for developers to be able to do that is because we have a lack of housing, we have youth outmigration, and this is one of the contributing factors. It also turns out that we are overregulated. In a year-long study that we did about some of the housing challenges in Wyoming, we are overregulated. There are too many opportunities to stop development, and we're also in competition with other states. Chairman, you mentioned that what are other states doing? Well, clearly other states have some things that we don't have, and that in terms is market. So they have a higher population, so developers can go there and do that. They may have a different regulatory burden than we do. And what we want to do is try to balance that out and try to compete. Because right now, when it comes to youth outmigration, we're losing. And so when you look at things like this, it is important to look at the details. It's important to get it right. I think our locals, as Mayor Collins mentioned, our locals do a good job of going through their process. And anything that we can do as a state to make that easier and make that so that housing can get done in the state is really critical. And so as you look at this, what I would ask you to do is think about not just what are the housing challenges, what are those private property rights that you're looking at, those are obviously important. But I also think it's important to look at the overall economic landscape and how important that young workforce is to our state's economic viability into the future. And so I'll stand for any questions, but I appreciate your consideration today and the questions you've asked so far.
Sure. Any questions for the director? I should say CEO, sorry. All right. I have one. You brought up youth and their exodus to the state, and I think that's interesting when it comes to connecting with this particular issue. You know, I think, when I think of zoning, especially within a town or a city, I think of, you know, planning and preparing to make a community one where people really enjoy being in whatever part of that community they're in for their living and or working. So we anticipate community leaders really designing it out so that, you know, you're not living right next to some kind of industrial thing that keeps you up at night, that type of thing. And so I'd just like you to opine for just a minute, if you would, about, you know, how our communities really are designed and how, whether or not that affects youth and whether they want to live here, because we've got well thought out communities. Please.
Chairman Bear, that's an excellent question, because we are seeing a transition in how communities are built. I think we've seen sprawl, we've seen the fact that there are very large lots that many of us maybe in this room can enjoy. But what we're seeing in other places is that the availability and the variability of housing and housing density is in flux. And so that change is happening. So higher density is actually more attractive to those folks who are in the younger demographic. And so as we look at this, that is going to be a challenge that we face, is that how do we increase the density, which everyone likes in concept and nobody likes next door. And so I think we as a state, we need to look at ways to encourage that and help people understand the benefits of that and not just the drawbacks. And so that density, that variability of housing and the price points is going to be something that's really, really important into the future.
Very good. Thank you. We appreciate you being here. Also, we're going to have public comment. So if there's anybody in the room from the public would like to come forward, please come forward. But right now, Ms. Childress, if we could go online and let's allow testimony from Mr. Stephen. If you could, please. Welcome. We'll be with you in just a moment.
Mr. Stephen, can you accept the email?
While we're waiting, Ms. Childress will allow you to continue to communicate with Mr. Stephen, try to get him in. Welcome to House Appropriations. We'll give you the floor for a moment. Would you please introduce yourself and let us know your thoughts on this particular bill, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rebecca Bexdale, and I live in Teton County. I wasn't planning on talking about this amendment, but, and I'm sorry I didn't catch the last speaker's name, but I would like to push back a little bit. We do hear people say that the youth leave, and if they head to California, Chicago, or New York, they're going to be right back. But I wonder how many people are tracking when people return, you know, and come back and start a family here. So that's one thing that I'm curious about. But my question about this amendment is, what happens if the land is publicly owned? So what if, I'm going to give a real example here of our Teton County Fairgrounds, which has been owned by the town of Jackson since 1941. This amendment doesn't seem to address public property. If you'll give me a minute, I'd like to talk about why I think this is important. So every time the town of Jackson has voted to move the fairgrounds, overwhelmingly the public voted not to move them. About a year before the fairgrounds, a section of the fairgrounds was taken for housing, the Paul Anthony, who is the Town of Jackson planner, wrote a 26-page thing when the hospital was trying to build housing on their publicly zoned property. So the housing, the hospital was trying to build housing on property zoned public, semi-public, just like the fairgrounds. And here's what he said. On the issue of residential development, the PSP zone is not typically intended to build residential housing, and that is why the only form of residential housing it allows is ARUs, no apartments, townhomes, condos, or single-family homes. Okay, that's what he said. Flash forward to a year later, and we realized that an unelected bureaucrat had filed for a federal grant for low-income housing and identified the fairgrounds as where the housing was going to be built. No one voted for this, okay? She just filled out a grant, and the federal government made a grant. And so the town began to move forward with building housing at the fairgrounds. And we lost a little bit of time because people did not associate 400 West Snow King as being at the fairgrounds. But in every map, historically, it's the fairgrounds. So we planned to, this was wildly unpopular in the town. We had over 100 people that would show up at town council meetings. We had 2,500 people sign a petition locally to stop this. It continued moving forward, but based on the town planner's own words, and in a 26-page document you can still read online, you couldn't build housing there. They were going to have to rezone it to high-density housing to build housing there. Well, that meant that the public could bring a referendum. In a lucky last-minute interpretation, the planner reversed his decision that he did with the hospital. So even though he went on the record and said you cannot have any type of housing other than, you know, a garage apartment that has something to do with the use of the land, you can't have housing. But right now, there is a 48-unit complex sitting on public property, and there's a 26-unit property sitting on public property. So who are the stakeholders? Who can... We needed every moment of that process to try to stop the housing being built at the fairgrounds. And I'm just wondering, in this situation, you know, it says, I'm sitting here reading it, and it says, well, if one of the owners, if this and that, well, what if it's publicly owned? And everyone is affected by this. So that is my question. It just seems a little suspicious that the public property is not addressed in the amendment, and it just, I just wonder what the real intentions are with this amendment. I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Bextel? Ms. Bextel, I have a question.
Okay.
This particular bill is dealing with protests, and it sounds like your community did that. You had 2,500 signatures, and it was an overwhelming no to what the planning commission or a commissioner was trying to do there. How do you feel about that process, and do you think that it was important that you had that ability?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's very important that we had that process. What we were waiting for was to bring a referendum. So the town of Jackson actually filed a zoning map amendment and said we're going to rezone this to high-density housing because that's what it takes to put housing on publicly owned property. And as this process dragged on, we were waiting to bring the referendum. And then they pulled their zoning map amendment at the last second, therefore taking our ability to bring a referendum and started building the housing. So the town at one point admitted they had to rezone. So that's what I'm saying about we needed every minute of that process because we didn't know what was coming next. Who would have ever dreamed that the town planner had a lucky last-minute interpretation right there on the line for a 48-unit housing complex after he had gone on the record and said it cannot happen unless you rezone the property. So, you know, why would we try to, and despite what people heard on the floor on Friday, the Teton County Commissioner, Luther Probst, said, the town said, we'd like to sign another long-term lease.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Sherwood?
I just feel like we're getting into, I don't want to bring up specific names, and I don't want to hash out issues that are local and that aren't relative to this bill.
Thank you for your comments, but I'm going to allow you to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, you don't have to mention specific names, but I feel like as a citizen, that's my right. So Teton County Commissioner Luther Probst sent a letter on September 16th of 2024 and said to the town council, we are not going to extend this 50-year lease until we explore all options at moving it. So if you're dealing with if you're dealing with a government that's playing a cat and mouse game, not acting in full faith, I'm just wondering why we're giving them a shorter time to pull this off. What the public, so I don't have a problem necessarily with private property. I was in a 4-month battle to build a 195 square foot shed in my backyard in East Jackson. Twice the town of Jackson ran off my workers. I didn't even have to pull a permit for it. But my neighbors did not want to see this shed blocking their view of the forest. My backyard is the forest. I live right by the elk refuge. So I can understand that it's frustrating when people try to protest something that you have a right to build. I get that. I was just in that process. But what if it's publicly owned property?
Thank you. Any further questions for Ms. Bechtel? We thank you for being here, and we appreciate your input on this bill.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Richards, go ahead with Mr. Stevens. Welcome, Mr. Stevens, to House Appropriations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you.
Good. Sorry about that technical difficulty there, but I think I got it figured out. But thank you for letting me be here today and testify in front of Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name's Jason Steven, and I'm a local developer in Cheyenne. And I just wanted to give you the short story of my long story of an experience that I had here with the protest petition. We were working on a development project, and I believe it's the one that Mayor Collins was speaking of as well, where we had a multifamily type project, an infill project, which ended up going in front of City Council, and a protest petition was filed. That petition ended up derailing what we considered, and I think most of the community, as well as most of City Council, considered to be would have been a real asset to the Cheyenne community. In that process, what happened was the petition that was presented was filled with a lot of misrepresentation and inaccuracies. And I believe it's wrong that a couple of individuals that live near a project are able to go ahead and put a petition together, run it around their neighborhood, and have those neighbors, be asked to sign something that really is misrepresenting the project that they're petitioning against. So ideally, I believe that this petition, the protest petition, and repealing it would be the right decision. But in the event that that's not what happens, I at least feel that it's important that we put limitations on what those protest petitions can contain and how they can be used to derail projects.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Steven? Mr. Steven, we thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you a quick question. This language that states that there would have to be a particularized harm, do you think that would have changed the situation in your protest?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that it would. I think that would have been helpful, but what it doesn't prevent is when these petitions go out and a particular property owner is representing that to other people, other individuals in the neighborhood, it doesn't prevent them from still misrepresenting it verbally. And I know when I've had people, try to ask me to sign a petition, they don't always necessarily just read you the information in the petition. They add a lot of extra information, their opinions and the way they feel about what it is they're trying to have you, help them to get approved. So I do think it probably would help if people read the petition and, if it was required to contain, accurate information. But even at that, though, I do think that if somebody's really, inspired to make a derail a project, they're still able to go around and, say whatever they want to say about the project.
Okay. Mr. Stephen, how far along was your project when this protest came along?
So it was during the zoning during the zoning process, in the annexation process. The property ended up getting annexed, but then the zoning that we needed to do the project failed on third reading. As far as how far we had taken it, we actually had taken the project pretty deep into design. And one of the reasons we did that was we wanted to be able to represent to the public what our intentions were and, how we felt that this project was going to be a real asset to the community. So, dollar-wise, we were hundreds of thousands into the project, not to mention the fact that we had already bought the land.
Good. All right. Thank you. We appreciate your being here. Ms. Richards, could we go ahead and get the other online, Jim Manley, to go ahead and testify? And then we'll get right to you gentlemen next.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
We can, Mr. Manley. Thank you for being here. Please let us introduce yourself and let us know what your thoughts on this bill.
Yes, first, Mr. Chair, let me clarify. My name is Mark Miller. I'm with Pacific Legal Foundation. Mr. Manley was on a delayed flight. And with your permission, I would testify. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Could you please restate your last name for us, please?
It's Mark Miller, M-I-L-L-E-R. First name Mark, M-A-R-K. I am a registered lobbyist in Wyoming. I testified earlier this session.
Okay, thank you for being here.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chair. As I said, my name is Mark Miller. I'm a senior attorney with Pacific Legal Foundation, a nonprofit law firm that specializes in property rights and policy. I've worked for Pacific Legal for most of the last 12 years, but I took 3 years off to go work for South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem as her chief of staff and general counsel, where I also focused and testified in legislative committees on land use issues like the bill before you on zoning protest petitions. My initial notes said I'm in favor of the bill, and Pacific Legal Foundation certainly is in favor of the bill as written. But you've certainly intrigued me, Mr. Chair, with this conversation about repeal. And some of the comments I'd like to just follow up on because I think some of the questions really get at why you would want to consider repealing this, notwithstanding that it would potentially have to go to conference committee if it got all the way through. You'd want to repeal the zoning protest petition, which I did not realize would be on the table. First, earlier it was asked, how many states have this process? Well, I have a report from Mercatus Center from 2022 that answers that very question. Only 20 states have this process. This zoning protest process, has nothing about property rights that requires this second bite at the apple. Only 20 states allow it, and it would be entirely reasonable for the legislature of Wyoming to eliminate it. Number two, I want to make an analogy because the mayor sort of brought this to the fore. He made the point, first we're bringing up the developer, like Mr. Stephen, applies for there's the zoning change. And so now he wants to move forward. The community has their chance then to oppose the zoning change. What happens here is, as somebody else said, we're getting a second bite of the apple, and now we're changing how many people would have to change their votes. But the analogy that I think is very fair would be, we had that first Super Bowl, and the Chiefs lost to the Eagles. And the Chiefs say, wait a minute, we want to protest the outcome. And the NFL would say, you know what, okay, you get another chance. Maybe now, as the mayor kind of implied, you can go get some additional players to play for the Chiefs who will show up at that second hearing and pressure the zoning board, whoever's making that zoning decision, who already approved it, to switch their votes. That is entirely unfair to the developer in Mr. Stevens' position. And further, it undercuts the efforts that Wyoming is properly making to increase the supply of housing. As it was said from the very beginning by the excellent speakers at the beginning, this was about cutting red tape. And although this bill is a good bill, and I am here to testify in favor of it, as the questions have shown, it's complicated. So number one, I would very much support repeal. That being said, number two, I'll turn to the bill and some of the other questions I've heard as the bill is written. The question about expansion, I think it's been addressed, but I want to elaborate because it was Pacific Legal that kind of put this into the discussion. The expansion of who could challenge is limited by that concrete and particularized harm language. And what does concrete and particularized harm mean? There was a question there. I would say what the courts would look at is nuisance. Somebody alluded to, when we plan a community, we don't want a factory next to homes. That would not be a problem here. Number one, in the zoning, the town is never going to approve that in the first place. But number two, if the town did, then absolutely, that's the kind of harm we're getting at. Public health and safety, what we traditionally called nuisance. And that's how the courts will look at it, which does remind me on the repeal point. If the neighbors are aggrieved by the approval of the zoning decision, they can go to court. This zoning petition, this petition process after the fact is just another bite at the apple. They can go to court if they don't like it, if something was done illegally. There's no reason to give them the second bite. But that being said, the bill as written, if that's what the committee is going to consider and not repealing, then I would say this is a step in the right direction in terms of reducing red tape, making it easier to build. I agree with Mr. Stephen, it could be better, but I'm a fan of incremental improvements. Yes, I would rather just get the repeal, but for now, I would be in favor of this bill if the committee wasn't in favor of passing it forward to the floor with a full repeal. And I'll stand by.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Questions for Mr. Miller? I have one. If we talk about repeal, that really opens it up to different communities having different processes for these protests. I think the reason this was probably put in statute to begin with was to just have some sideboards. And here we are narrowing those sideboards a little bit from the state level, but yet allowing local control as to, how they're going to go within those sideboards. Do you have any thoughts about completely taking the sideboards off and letting different communities have different protests, processes, and how that might affect development?
Well, number one, my hope would be that the local communities would recognize the wisdom of the legislature in repealing the objection process and recognize this is not interfering with local control. To repeal the bill would simply mean that the local control, that zoning board, has approved the zoning change. So local control was observed and recognized as most people understand it. I want to make a sub-point that the best form of local control is the individual property owner. After all, it's their constitutional property rights that are at issue. But conceding that generally when we use the phrase local control, we're talking about the local community. This isn't about taking away local control. It's saying local control has made a decision to make the zoning change. Neighbors, if you don't like it, if you repeal, neighbors, if you don't like it, go to court and say that the zoning decision maker did something illegal. So it's not taking away local control at all. I hope that's responsive to the question, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your input. Okay. Gentlemen, we'll start at the right and just please, and we'll go to the left. Please introduce yourself and let us know your opinion. We're going to be closing down public comment in about 30 minutes. Is there anyone else? I think, Mr. McKay, you'd like to comment? Please come forward. Is there anyone else in the room that wants to comment on this bill? Come on up, Mr. Schwartz. You're welcome to join us. Okay. All right. And you're welcome too as well. All right. So we're going to start here on my right, your left, and we'll just work our way down. We'll move to Mr. Schwartz then, since he's stepping up. You get first shot at it. Okay. All right. Go ahead, sir. Introduce yourself. For the
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I'm Bob McLaurin with the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. We represent the state's 99 cities and towns. We came here to support the bill that's drafted. We worked with the task force over the last summer. But if in the wisdom of the committee, you want to repeal this, we would be okay with that too. Like the gentleman said previously, there are plenty of procedural, processes where people have the opportunity to testify about a zoning hearing. So this provides a second bite of the apple that we don't necessarily think is necessary. So we would support this bill, or if you want to repeal it, we would support that as well too.
Okay. Any questions? All right. I have one. We heard some testimony from the public about the actual community, the city making some of these changes which the bill doesn't address right now. It's really about private property. But do you have any thoughts about what was testified on here in regards to Jackson?
No, sir. I mean, I live in that community, but I didn't, and I managed that community for 25 years, but it was after my time as the city manager, so I really don't have any comments on that, sir.
So during your time, you didn't try to do
It was
anything?
perfect when I
It was
was,
perfect, and you had a wonderful fairgrounds, I see. All right. Well said. Thank you. All right, sir, please, thank you for being here.
Chairman, Scott Hoverson, I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Community Development Authority, which is the state's housing finance agency for the state of Wyoming. I come in support of this bill, like Mr. McLaren said. I think that this bill, gives us some change in what the protest petition was initially set up, as it went through the Regulatory Reduction Task Force and some of those recommendations. Seeing the changes, I know the 300 feet, that was one of the representatives from Wyopass, which is the city planners, the state association had made that mention that 300 feet is the distance that most cities and towns notice people. So that made real sense to make that consistent with what they did already. Supported in the fact that over the last 3 years, WCDA has commissioned a couple studies. In 23 and 24, we did a study on the statewide housing needs assessment to look at the demographics of the state of Wyoming and the need for additional housing in the state. This was done in conjunction and to kind of complement what the Wyoming Business Council did from the business side of things. We were just looking strictly at the housing side of things. And that study said that we needed between 27,000 and 38,000 housing units in the state of Wyoming by the year 2030. So then our next thing after we had that study done was to say, okay, now that we know there's this need, how are we going to do that? So we went to the governor, and last year he requested some funding, an appropriation for some funding for that, and that didn't go. But I went back to my board of directors and said, hey, if we want to get this done, we're going to have this study done. So this study was completed in December of 2024, and the statewide housing strategic action plan has 27 recommendations. Some of those include a housing incentive fund, which Representative Sherwood brought forward but died on the floor. And this protest petition was one of those. It's was one of the things that the study showed that developers would be more willing to come into the state and start developing if they knew some of these regulations weren't so strict that they could proceed and probably get projects done. So this was one of those recommendations, and like I said, there's 27 of them in that, and I plan on, over this next year, getting that out and meeting with a lot of yourselves, representatives and senators across the state to talk about what that plan is and how we can start implementing that. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Okay. Any questions? I don't recall, I heard a lot of testimony today. Did you say that you're in favor of the bill as it's written now, as far as constricting the ability to do these protests?
Yes, and if it was your pleasure to repeal it, that we would stand for that too. We would be in favor of that.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir. Welcome to House Appropriations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Kaler with the Wyoming Economic Development Association. And one of the fun parts about being this far down on the docket is a lot of my points have already been made. And so to save time, I'll say agree with a lot. what was already said. But just to reiterate that the housing shortage exists across the state. And we understand that, of course, a lot of these decisions and efforts to address that shortage have to be made locally. But this is one of the measures the state can take to help that be done at a local level. And just to reiterate the most recent point, this is one of many measures that would help housing across the state of Wyoming. And so I think moving forward, it's just great to keep in the back of your mind that this isn't the silver bullet that does it. There's a lot more that still can be done. To speak specifically to workforce housing, which is an area that we hear a lot from, it is difficult to recruit people to work in the state who then can't find a place to live. And it's not an anecdote. We've heard it in multiple different communities across the state where a person will be extended a job offer, come to try to find a place to live, and then have to decline that job offer because there actually just isn't a place for them to live. And so anything that we can do to make the development of housing projects happen, we're in support of, and in support of the bill as it is now, but as many others have said, would be supportive of a larger repeal as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you for being here. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on. Mr. McKay, welcome to House Appropriations again.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for having me. Rennie McKay, President of the Wyoming Business Alliance, and we're a private sector organization that advocate for all of our businesses. Our members come from every industry, every corner of the state, and every size. And I will say that the top issue for them right now is workforce and finding the talent they need. They are not able to grow as fast as they can. They're not as profitable as they can be because they don't have the workforce they need. And housing is a part of that. I think 90% of municipalities across the state reported that they have a housing shortage right now. And our housing inventory is down 39% compared to 2018. So that's kind of how significant it is. And as we've looked at this issue, the underlying our housing shortage is a pretty severely over-regulated marketplace for housing. And we're probably, some people put us in the top third of the most regulated state for housing in the country. And most of that regulation comes at the local level. And I would like to just compliment if some municipalities have recognized that when you talk about caps on how many stories you can build, how small a lot size you can go to, what your setbacks are, all of those are fixes. And some of our municipalities have really recognized this and have really gone to work on it, and they're seeing the market respond. And that's a really positive thing. At the state level, there aren't a ton of regulations and levers to pull to start to bring down the cost of housing. And all these regulations just add cost. I really appreciated hearing from that local developer, and there's many more you could hear from that just, these regulations drive up the cost per door. So when you want a market-based solution, we need to get some regulations out of the way. And so I think before we go ask municipalities to change too much more, Montana, for instance, did a mandatory menu bill where municipalities had to start implementing some of these changes to try to bring down the cost of building. Didn't go there with the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. I got the privilege of serving on that, but I think that the municipalities are starting to lead and really complement. Cheyenne, Mills, and Laramie have done some particularly good work. So I think this is an area where the state really needs to take that look in the mirror and find out at this level, is there anything we can do? And so really appreciate you looking at this. We definitely support this bill. The repeal would be better, I think. And Mr. Chairman, as you'd asked, we looked as the Regulatory Reduction Task Force about changing this to give municipalities the ability to just set up their own protest petition system. And you'd need to do that more proactively. Just the repeal would mean you cannot. So, but then I do want to just go to the point, there still involves a lot of local control, and the Regulatory Reduction Task Force got into this a lot because they know me a little bit and would know that I would be a tough neighbor to live next to. And so if one of my neighbors didn't like me and wanted to stop me from doing something like putting a mother-in-law in, if it would take a zoning change, that neighbor, just because I'm not a great person to live next to, can block the project. But this bill starts to do some things that gets rid of that. And I think that that does really make a change. But that doesn't mean my neighbors wouldn't have the opportunity to get involved if you repeal this. because there is a notice sent out to all of the neighbors before this vote can happen on the zoning change. So the neighbors get notice in the mail, certified mail goes out to them. They can show up and voice their concern about me as a neighbor and sway that vote. I think Representative Filer showed that that did happen here in this community, where the folks got their letter in the mail, had the chance to have the local control, and got involved. So I think that you've got a really good fix with the repeal. I think if you go back to the original 50% at least, that would change things. And Mr. Chairman, that discussion about the distance, part of that was, you know, there are certain parts of town where, again, it could be one neighbor gets to veto your project. And that veto-ocracy is what definitely has concerned us as we've looked at it. And the main thing is I think we want to send a good signal to the market to say this is a good place to build. We've got developers that estimate it for, if you want to do $1 million project, that just delays is per month, for per $1 million per month is $10,000 carrying cost. And so if you want to encourage housing and bring down costs per door, we want to go fast and we want to create certainty. So thank you for considering this, and stand for any questions.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. McKay? All right. I have one. So we inserted, and I think this happened in the Senate, more than one. So now instead of there being just any one single landowner, it has to be more than one. Do you see that as an improvement?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, definitely, because that, when the Senate went down to 33%, again, 33% could be one neighbor. So that's a good fix to try to find a little bit of common ground in there.
Okay, very good. All right. Mr. Appropriations. Did I pronounce that right? I always wonder. That's such a long name.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
I struggle, and I apologize if I got it wrong.
Mr. Chairman, Nick Agopian, I've dealt with this my whole life. It's always fun to see people just guess at it, because they land on a lot of different places. I'll be very brief today. As it stands now, this bill, I'm here representing Teton County Board of County Commissioners. It's very easy for us to support this bill today. It does not impact Title 18, which is the county statutes. We did have, and I did have, the pleasure of tracking the Regulatory Reduction Task Force for the last year as they went through and discussed this. This seems like a very good option, a very good first step to help support the development of housing within within towns and municipalities. And with that, I'd stand for questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Agopian? Agopian. Agopian. I'm going to work on that. Thank you. I prefer Nick, but all right. Any questions? All right. No, I have one. You know, you represent Teton County. We had some testimony about Jackson. Do you care to opine on that testimony about the issue with local governments also affecting this zoning issue, this protest?
At this point, I don't believe I have any comments about the local community. Those would probably be better answered by the gentleman following me.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schwartz, welcome back to House Appropriations. How are you today? And
Mr. Chairman and committee, once again, it's great to be back in this room. I was actually in another committee hearing, so I did not hear all the previous testimony. Nonetheless,
well, we're glad you rushed down. We're glad you rushed down here to join us.
Well, I actually rushed up. But, I'm Andy Schwartz. I represent the town of Jackson. The town of Jackson supports this bill as written. I participated in the 2 years of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. was involved in those conversations. I would just say the housing issues in Jackson are probably more acute than anywhere else in the state, and we have made many efforts to address those problems, both with the county and in the town with their changes in regulations. I don't think this will make a significant difference, but we do support it, and I will stand for any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Schwartz? I have a question for you. You just stated that you've made, that the city of Jackson's made many efforts to resolve this housing issue. Can you opine on what some of those efforts are?
We have Mr. Chairman, we have made efforts, for instance, making it easier to apply for an accessory residential unit, speeding up applications for multifamily residential housing. Those come to mind right away. I'm sure I could think of more if I had been prepared for that question. That's my fault, not yours.
Okay, you've heard the, well, did you hear the testimony earlier? Okay, well, I encourage you to go back and watch the video and just get with me directly if you have any other comments about the testimony before you got here. But I have heard lots of complaints about that community as far as their, putting roadblocks up for construction. And so I hope that you continue to work for ways to really improve the opportunities for developers within your community, especially on this housing issue. I do have concerns myself about the fairgrounds, though, so we want to keep those kind of things in our communities.
Mr. Chairman, I did not realize we were discussing the fairgrounds. I will get back to you.
Please.
I'm actually working with the town administrator to get a sheet on that in response to the budget amendment that was proposed.
Okay, we would appreciate that. Thank you for being here. Is there any other public comment in the room? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Move the bill, do pass by Angelos, seconded by Sherwood. All right, we'll begin on the bill. So we have page 1.
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Haroldson.
I'd like to test the waters because I do believe we have a robust system for hearing concerns in regards to the zoning. And so I would like to move the amendment to repeal section 15-1-603. And if I get a second, I'll kind of explain my heart on it.
Okay, moved by Haroldson, seconded by Sherwood. Go ahead, Representative Haroldson.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that we've seen is coming from a smaller community that we're struggling with housing issues, we're struggling with those issues. Sometimes we've seen that there have been concerns over advancing or building or even any changes to our little communities. And as I hear people's heart on that and frustration on that, I also know that we need to be careful, that people buy property, have property rights, and then those get trampled on. And I disagree with that. So I think that there is already notice, there's already opportunity for hearing, and there's also a legal recourse that they can take if for some reason this doesn't walk down the road they felt it should, and I believe that's intact. Now, with that being said, I do have concerns in regards to public lands. I think we need to have more input on those, and maybe we can have a conversation down the road on that. But I think at this point, a repealing of 15-1-603 could be an answer for helping move forward some of our housing issues and just across the board industry in our state. So,
any other comments? Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little conflicted here. I live where I live, which is a 120-year-old neighborhood, and I live there because I like it. I like it the way it is. And there has been, throughout this discussion, this kind of assumption that growth is always good. And I would say it's always inevitable, but I don't know that it's good. I'm one of those people whose children had to leave their hometown and go live somewhere else, and they actually live somewhere else, even more rural. I don't know that I can add much to that. I just, there was a comment that actually kind of rubbed me the wrong way that says, our job is to remove constraints to growth. And, maybe my mother was right. She says, you're kind of a pillar of the community. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, you like to stand around and hold things up. I'm going to urge caution, whatever we do. Very, very strong advocate for private property rights. But when you start getting into public property and the way that things have been, I lived in Jackson back in the 60s. And I like things the way they are. I think that's what makes Wyoming attractive. And if we are not careful with how we embrace growth, we end up being another Colorado Springs, and I don't want to see that.
Further comments on the amendment? I have a comment. I mentioned earlier that I've gone through the zoning process for a large property, and we had protests against our rezoning for the use that we wanted to make it for. And we went through an extensive hearing process, took about a year, cost us about $100,000, and nobody likes doing that when you're trying to develop. But I can tell you 30 years later, because we went through that process, we did it legitimately, we dealt with the misrepresentations from some of the neighbors and got the truth out there, we now have some of the best neighbors of a property where we're shooting on it, and if anything keeps you, can disrupt your life at home, it's to hear shots going off all the time. This is a shooting park. And so looking back on it, it was a pain at the time, but it was well worth it going through it so that the neighbors are satisfied with that property and its use now. And so I would caution completely eliminating this process. And maybe if we find out that tightening up the sideboards as the good committee for reducing regulations came up with, then maybe the repeal is a better idea in the future. But I'd say right now, I would be very cautious about completely taking away that opportunity for those neighbors to have one more bite at the apple, is what we've heard. Sometimes they might have gotten the notice, they might not have realized what a big deal it was, but having those robust debates and discussion, I think, are very important. So having said that, is there any other comments on the motion? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. I'm going to be supporting the motion because I'm not in favor of 2 Super Bowls.
2 Super Bowls. Yeah, the commercial cost has got to go down if you do. All right, any further comments on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Representative Harrelson's motion, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no? No. Okay, let's just see a show of hands. All those for the motion, all those opposed. Okay, the motion fails on a tie vote. All right. Any further discussion on page 1? Page 2. Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, just for the sake of discussion, line 6, I would move to strike 2/3 and replace that with a simple majority.
Moved by Pendergraft, seconded by Sherwood. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the Pendergraft motion say aye. Aye. All those opposed? That carries. Okay. All right. Further motions? Go ahead, Representative Pendergraft.
Mr. Chairman, we have at our disposal, I guess it would be amendment number 1. I'm having trouble reading that. At any rate, I would move the Bear amendment at this time.
Okay, so let's read that to the public. So this would add language on page 1, line 2. After specified, inserting prohibiting a governing body from imposing fees or conditions on residential or commercial development as specified. Also on line 7, after 151603A, insert and by creating a new subsection C. On page 2, after line 9, inserting subparagraph C that states no governing body shall impose a monetary fee, non-monetary condition, or other concession on residential or commercial development related to the provision of workforce housing, unmet housing needs, or affordable housing within the jurisdiction of the governing body unless the Wyoming Constitution or other state law expressly provides authority for the imposition of the fee, condition, or concession. On page 2, line 11, after filed, insert or fees, non-monetary conditions, or other concessions imposed by a governing body on residential or commercial development. And the purpose of this amendment is to address that other portion, and that is public development rather than just private development. Seconded by Alaman, moved by Pendergraph. Any discussion on the amendment? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some concern that it's not germane, that we may, if we were on the floor, we might see a rules committee on this one. Specifically, the bill is found in Title 15, but the amendment, the way that it's written, if you want it to apply to counties, I think that goes into Title 18. So yeah, I'm just concerned that the amendment is broader than the intent of the bill.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Pendergraph's motion, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Okay, that motion carries. Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, Ms. Childress, please take the roll. Ms. Richards, sorry. Please take the roll.
Roll call vote on Senate File 40 do pass with amendments. Representative Alaman? Aye. Representative Angelos? Aye. Representative Harrelson?
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft?
Aye.
Representative Sherwood?
No.
Representative Smith excused. Chairman Bear?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, 5 ayes, 1 no, 1 excused.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Representative Filer, would you, or Representative Yen, do you care to carry this bill? Okay. One or the other. Okay. All right. We've got 17 minutes. We did pretty well there. Nope.
Mr. Chairman, can you gavel out?
What's that? Meeting adjourned.